Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on what part of the world you're in. This is the Creating Strategic Alignment webinar by the Balanced Scorecard Institute. I'm Joe DiCarlo, the Vice President of Worldwide Engagement and Delivery and a Senior Consultant with the BSI. Just a few administrative notes. We are recording this webinar and we will email you a link to view probably within about 48 hours. And also there will be a handout of the slides, so you'll be able to get those for reference later on, and there'll be a PDF copy. So questions during the webinar, please use the Q&A box, not the chat box for those questions. I'm being assisted today by my colleague Candace Raymer, and she monitors those, and as we get toward the end, we'll start taking a look at those questions. Also, there were a number of questions that were pre-submitted based on registration process. And so we'll be taking a look at those. And interestingly enough, the bulk of them were for this first session. As you know, the session's being run 3 times today in different appropriate time zones for attendees. Again, my name is Joe, 47 years in work-life careers. I like to say I'm on my at least 3rd or 4th work-life career. Started 13 years in a engineering university at the Milwaukee School of Engineering in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and then went on to work for the IBM Corporation for 25 years, stationed both in Milwaukee and San Jose, California, where I'm broadcasting from today. And did a stint as an executive in residence with the Plug and Play Tech Incubator in Sunnyvale. They have at any point in time, they have about 250 startups under about 3 different locations in the Bay Area. And currently now a officer, consultant, and instructor with the Strategy Management Group and the Balanced Scorecard Institute. Since coming to the BSI, I've completed 72 client consulting, internal training, or advisor engagements. So a broad spectrum of for-profit, nonprofit, and government engagements. And still a learner. That's one thing that you're going to find out, I think, in this day and age, that just getting a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, you got to get some specific training as you go along. So I'm still working in a formal structure for my doctoral degree, but have to finish the research, which is becoming increasingly a probable problem that I'm just entirely too busy, I guess, with the consulting for the BSI. My contact information is over on the left, so please, you can, it'll be in the deck that you get as a copy, and it's also at the end. So, do any of these scenarios sound familiar with regards to alignment, strategy alignment, getting everybody on the same page? All those words start to describe what strategic alignment is all about in organizations. And I will categorically say that this is one of my favorite topics to talk about in regards to strategy development and execution, mainly because I spent a lot of years in this when I was at the university from an organization-wide process. At IBM from a departmental side. I think I stopped counting how many departmental scorecards I assisted in. And now with the BSI and just a grand set of clients that I've been working with over my tenure with the Balanced Scorecard Institute. One of the first ones is this top one. Strategy has not been effectively cascaded to lines of business, departments, and individuals. Well, by its very nature, if that's the circumstances in your organization, you are supporting and lending itself without this cascaded or aligned strategy to a silo culture. And I think this always seems to come up. We have silos in our organization. Departments do it this way, other departments do it that way. There may not be an organization-wide strategy, so these silos just start popping up all over the place. Another one is they don't understand where they fit. They overhear executives talking about a strategy, but there's no direct communications. There's no local communications from their department heads or anything like this. And that very statement itself further anchors in the silo culture. There are too many disparate projects or initiatives. And there's ambiguity about which ones are owned by the departments or individuals and which ones are owned by the corporate level strategy. So that's more support for the silo culture. And unfortunately, that communications business is a definite fault line in strategy execution, because a lot of organizations build strategies, talk about it initially, and then stop talking about it for whatever reason. And it just fades away in their minds. So that starts to bring up the questions from the individual saying, is the strategy real? If so, I'm an individual contributor. How does my team supposed to execute on it? And when you get down to that level, the silos culture is dug in pretty deep. So you're going to have a little bit of task on your hands to get that strategy. So it is definitely cascaded or aligned to the organizations in a formal manner. So the topics we're going to cover today are some background on why alignment is required. And I will categorically say, if not once, twice, or three times on this webinar, just because your organization creates an organization-wide strategy, nobody can ever get up from that executive suite that created that organization-wide strategy and claim they have an aligned strategy, because that organization strategy is the high-level organization strategy that the organization is using to determine how well its success is. If they have not cascaded or aligned that down to the departments and teams and individuals, it is not aligned. It is only a strategy that exists in the executive suite, so to speak. Now, when to align the strategy? Quite frankly, I've had some clients that are very aggressive. We get done doing the organization-wide, and because there's very few elements that are needed from that organization-wide strategy to align it to the departments, sometimes they've said we can start aligning the departments now. And I'll explain what that one very important strategic element is that's needed in order to conduct alignment throughout an organization. How to conduct it, we're going to go through those steps, and how to measure the success. There's any number of measures that you can look at and quantifiably assess how well that alignment is doing at the organization. And then the benefits derived from an overall alignment throughout the organization. Now, if you look in textbooks, you can Google alignment, you can Google strategy alignment, you can Google strategy cascading. You're going to get thousands of definitions that come up. But these seem to all rally around these three. It's all about translating the organization-wide or enterprise-level-wide strategy down into departments, business and support units. And then from the department, business, and support units, team and individual objectives are developed. So you can picture the highest level strategy objectives coming down to mid-range at the department or support unit level, and down to the lowest level, which is now into the individuals and teams. And by the way, this teams business is very important these days, because most organizations do not get a lot of the strategy executed, or the projects are initiatives associated with that strategy until they use teams. Another one is alignment translates the high-level strategy objectives, depending on your organization's overall strategy development process, into lower-level objectives. Now, what does that mean, depending on your organization's overall strategy development process? Some organizations, they like to use what I call derivative meanings of strategic objectives. They might call them goals, they might call them priorities, those types of things. They're more textual in nature. And in many cases, they vary away from or stray away from the continuous improvement activity that objectives or strategic objectives are designed around by their very nature. The third one is team and individual objectives link day-to-day work with the department objectives and into the corporate vision. That's very generic, and of the three, that is probably the weakest, because it doesn't get to the actual process steps that were used in 1 and 2. So here's a visual definition of what I just said, if we use, especially on that first bullet from the previous slide. The organization-wide strategy, I call it sometimes the big tent strategy of the organization. They do everything specifically if they're a for-profit organization, to achieve that vision. They set these high-level objectives. Executives and board members maybe got together and put this strategy together. They did maybe come down to the department levels and pull some of the department managers, business line executives up and say, this is what the overall organization has to achieve. But now, as I said, if they don't do anything further, that strategy exists strictly with that group. There's nothing to be said for the individuals at the department and unit strategy or individuals to say, how do I play in that, until they do alignment. So the next step is to get down to the department strategy. So the question becomes, how does my unit contribute to the organization-wide strategy? And you'll see the strategy is cascaded down to that department and unit. One of the things you're going to hear me say throughout this presentation is the only thing we need from that organization-wide strategy to set up the alignment at the department and unit level are the strategic objectives. That's all. I'll have another graphic later on to show that. And in the conduct execution side of building aligned strategies at the department and unit level, I have that graphic as well. It's all about how the units relate to what that higher level organization-wide strategy needs to achieve, and now their departments have to align themselves to that strategy. And then eventually, the unit has to say to its employees or individual employees or teams, this is how I need you to contribute to our organization-wide strategy, because remember, the unit level strategy was cascaded from the organization-wide strategy, and now the unit is cascading it or aligning it down to the individual or teams. Consequently, all the performance that comes out of employees' objectives and goals, department strategy comes right back up to say, do we have success all the way through the organization? And this is a cycle that takes place every year. You've probably been in your organizations long enough to understand that annual strategy meeting or strategy retreat, whatever they call it, is taking a look at, if you had a strategy, how is that performing? Are we getting the response that we needed? Are we getting the success on our projects and initiatives? Are we getting our success on the KPIs we put in place? Oh, by the way, does the strategy need to change for the next year? Because some strategic elements are sending us a signal that our customers want something different, or we've got some particular threats that we have to deal with from a SWOT analysis. So all these things start to come into play as to how the alignment is going to change over the next year. So why is it required? Well, it really comes down to focusing the people's work and the resources. This alignment business puts that high-level strategy of the organization into play, because it's down at the business unit department level where all the action is happening every hour of every day of every week and year for the business or the organization. If you don't have alignment, you probably got chaos, or like I just mentioned earlier, you probably got silos. I mean, every department's doing what it wants to do. There's nothing to hook to something higher level for the overall organization. And let's face it, no organization can succeed unless all of their departments and units are on the same page, executing against the same strategy. Alignment measures, they level the motivation by common vision and strategy. What you're going to find out at the department level, it's all about that mission or purpose statement. The vision of the organization is at the highest level. That organization-wide strategy sets the vision. You at the department level are motivated by your mission, and then a whole bunch of other strategic elements that you analyze for your department. Then the people understand the supporting strategy is their job. This is why it's down to now, and I said that earlier, it was down to tier 3. So people are self-motivated and not merely complying to the rules. In other words, it's the same thing every day. If I just comply to these rules, everything's fine. Well, you got motivation as enhancements are the key thing on alignment. And that's why So many times you'll hear me talk about things like rewards and recognition that need to be put in, and plus specifically for that tier 3, which is the objectives for the teams and individuals. So this is what it looks like on a visual alignment process. So let me go through. I'm going to start from top to bottom. Tier 1, as we call it at the Balanced Scorecard Institute, is the organization or enterprise-wide strategic objectives. And in the case of a balanced scorecard, that's how they're depicted there next to that tier 1 organization-wide green box at the top. Notice that whole business at tier 1 has been driven by the mission and vision and the values and the strategic themes and results of the organization. So the organization has its own vision. A classic one was back in the late 90s when Starbucks was on its ramp up to be the dominating coffee house around the world. I think it was about 1996. They put out a vision statement that said 2,000 stores by the year 2000. Perfect vision statement, time-bounded, quantifiable, and the good news was they blew by it before 2000. So, of course, they had to retool their vision statement. But they used that for 2 reasons. One, to set a shot across the bow of the rest of the coffee houses that were coming up. And the second was to motivate its employees so that everybody was focused on achieving that vision by the year 2000. Their mission statement was, mission statements are basically, what products and services do you deliver? To whom do you deliver them to? And what's the benefit that they resolve? That is something that the individual units, support units and business departments, they're going to create a mission statement or a purpose statement just like that. Why are they in business at tier 2? Then you create a whole series of strategic objectives, the ellipses. You organize them on what's called perspectives. And the one that's shown here is for a for-profit company, because everything starts at the organizational capacity level, which is the right people with the right skills at the right time. And you have the right infrastructure, you have the right tools, technology, and governance. You put all of that to work in the process perspective, which is creating better efficiency, better quality, better service delivery, better timeliness, new products. So it's putting everything to work that the organizational capacity can basically develop. And they're doing it for the customer who's going to buy them. So that's why you see things like customer experience, customer satisfaction, and other things like increased market share, all on the customer perspective. And at the end of the day, for a for-profit organization, it is only about one thing, making the money. So up there, those objectives are typically increase revenues, reduce costs, and improve profitability. Now, in the nonprofit government world, you switch the customer and financial perspectives. Governments are not out to make money. They just need to subsist because their funding comes from the tax rolls and other areas of the government. Nonprofits are the same way because they're given a huge write-off in terms of taxes. And the other thing that's usually happening there in the customer level is there's really, if you look at a lot of governments and a lot of nonprofits, you can boil down all the objectives in the customer stakeholder perspective to just one: improve my quality of life. Governments need to improve the quality of life of the citizens. Nonprofits need to improve the quality of life of their customers or stakeholders. The other 2 perspectives, organizational capacity and process, stays the same. You cascade the objectives from the tier 1 down to the tier 2. And it's not always all of them from tier 1, because tier 2 units, look at them by nature, they have very specific things that they work on, but they need to be able to be connected back to some of the objectives at the tier 1 level. And I'll have a sample to show you in just a minute. But the process is the same. They don't get to fool around with the perspective names. They don't need themes, and they don't need values, and they don't need a vision, because it's already been created by tier 1. The only thing they need to do is get a new mission or purpose statement for their department, and then set about creating and analyzing the other strategic elements that are present in their specific unit. like a SWOT analysis, customer value proposition. They need to know who their stakeholders and customers are and what their needs are. And then they can start building objectives by first looking back at the tier one perspectives and say, which of those objectives does my business unit or department strongly have influence on? And then what are the ones that we need to run our unit or our department that are not listed in that overall tier one? So it's a combination. And then eventually those business units, the manager has to sit down with the teams and individuals and say, here's what I need you to work on for the next year that relate to our strategy at tier two. So those are called tier threes. And then that's typically these days a combination of work experiences that are individualistic and also part of a team. There's some comments on that tier three scorecards that you're aligning personal objectives defined by job descriptions and work assignments. And the reason we put that there is that with those, a lot of clients I've worked with, they start wanting to go to tier three. And my first question is, well, what is the state of the job descriptions and the critical functions that they have to perform from the day they were hired? And everybody starts looking at the ceiling. It's like they haven't kept up. They got employees that have been there 5-10 years and they're still in the records. They're still with that job description that came in 10 years ago. So that's one of the key things on tier three that you have to take a look at. But it's this alignment or cascading of just objectives. I always get questions about, well, what about the KPIs at tier one? Are we cascading those down to the tier twos? No, because the tier twos are having their own objectives that they have to measure at their level. And the tier threes, they set their employees and teams up with very specific individual and team goals that they want them to accomplish over the course of the next year. Oh, what about the projects and initiatives from tier one? Are we cascading those down? No, because the initiatives and projects at tier one organization wide are usually mega projects. You're going to put in a data warehouse. You're going to put in an ERC system. You're going to put in a company-wide CRM system. Those are at the behest of the organization-wide strategy. And that's what you're going to have the other teams use as a part of their technology going forward, but they're just users. So and there's other things also tier one, like maybe tier one's doing a major initiative on innovation. So they're going to ramp up a whole series of infrastructure things that take place that serves the whole organization. That's not at the purview of a department. So you don't cascade or align initiatives down to the tier twos as well. Now, the reality is some of the employees at the tier two level will maybe be on project teams that are working on a tier one initiative or project, but the tier two doesn't own that. The tier one does. So there's a little bit of understanding about what it is that cascades from tier one to tier two. And now you know it's just the objectives, the strategic objectives. And then you also know now that some of those initiatives and projects at tier one may have members from tier two units. And of course, those are teams and individuals, but that's not a project owned by the tier two. The tier two may have its own. Like for instance, in one client, they need an engineering department. They needed their own specific CAD system. That is owned by the tier two because nobody else in the organization uses CAD in this case, except engineering. So it's very specific. So I want to just level set that as we go forward, because there's always this big feeling of necessity to cascade KPIs down into all the organizations. KPIs stay in their respective tier across 1, 2, or 3. So when to align. So if we talk about this, I'm not going to talk about all of these items except for the bolded ones. When the organization finally realizes that their insufficient, poorly managed resources are not connected to anything after it gets out of the executive suite, you have to align through the objectives down to the departments or units. If the strategy is detected as being not understood or poorly communicated, that's because what's happened is the strategy at tier one has been built. They've invited in the department managers to listen to a presentation and receive some documentation on it. and they've told them to go back to your business units or departments and talk to your group about it. But something happens between that meeting and when the unit manager or the director gets to his or her office, and all of a sudden it doesn't get done. That's because it's really not theirs. It's the tier one strategy. So the minute you align, now all of a sudden they have skin in the game at the tier two level. There are objectives, there are KPIs that they're going to be measured about. So now communications ramps up severely. No accountability. If you only have a tier one, anybody in tier two or below just says that's their business. They own that, not me. And when you got this developer implementer linkage that is not there, in other words, the people that help develop it are also implementing it, you get much more return on that investment than you do if it's just somebody else does it and you try to slide it under the door and say, here, follow this. And if there's no monitoring, of course, there's not going to be as good of results. And you have to have leadership, though, at the senior manager leader level. Now, let's talk about this leader definition. When you go through an alignment process, so at the executive level, sure, you got executives, CEO, vice presidents, CFOs, CIOs, all the big execs up on the 45th floor. They're at that organization-wide strategy. Now, when you get down to the business units, the department heads, and they are looked at as the leaders for those departments. The problem is a lot of organizations, when they say the word leader, they think 45th floor execs, midstream, mid-floor, maybe the 20th floor for the departments, the managers of those departments or divisions. The problem is there are leaders inside of those departments that are identified as leaders by the mere function that they perform every day, which is a team leader, a supervisor, a team person that's with a short team, 2 or 3 person team. Those people are leaders as well. So the real business about leadership here has got to be tackled in terms of bringing all leaders on board, because now that's when the execution of the strategy at the department level becomes very real. So let's take a look at the steps. And these steps are very, very the same, doesn't vary. So I've seen some clients, even after we've gone in and completed the alignment, they try to make some changes on this, and they call back and say something's not working. And I said, well, show me the process you use. And they injected something else between 4 and 5 or 7 and 8. Where did you get this from? This is a script. This is like anything else. It's like a specification that you need to follow as you go through. And by the way, this I've been doing this a lot based on experience from IBM, and also all of my engagements through the Institute follow the same script. In fact, this particular one, I just finished aligning 13 units inside an organization in the Caribbean in Barbados last week. And that was obviously done all virtually, but it follows the same. 13 units, 2, 3, 4 people from every unit in the same Zoom session, and 13 or 14 breakout rooms that they were working together. First thing I always do on an alignment is I have them document their business and support unit processes. Why? Because you're down to the unit level now, department unit or support unit. When you pull a group of people together, depending on what size the unit is, you'll have a lot of business processes in there that some others don't know what they are. And this just helps them get in this is not scientific. This is not, oh, bring me all your Lean Six Sigma documentation and all your process document. This is just a flat out shout out. What does our business or support user do on a regular basis? And we document those. And then if they don't have a mission or a purpose statement, we create one. And again, this process is very interesting to see, because now when you've got 2, 3, 4, 5 representatives from each business unit, now they're going into some very, very creative thinking about what is it we deliver, who do we deliver it to, and for what benefit? That's the mission or purpose statement. It really comes down to that. We don't need an Encyclopedia Britannica several pages documentation about that. We just need something that people can look at and understand what you produce, who you produce it for, and for what benefit do they realize from it. The next thing they have to do is do a stakeholder customer needs analysis. Well, first they have to document who the customers and stakeholders are. And this is interesting because some units will be all internal to the organization, like HR, maybe IT, maybe finance, legal, and marketing. But then there's this sales group who are definitely going to be customer facing as well as internal. So they have to identify who those customer stakeholders are and what their needs are. This is typically the start of a discussion about, hey, sales is saying, our portfolio of products that we've been using for the last 2 or 3 years, client customers and potential customers are not happy because they haven't been kept up to speed. They need something different. This is where that messaging starts to come across. Now, what's the customer value proposition? Even if you're an internal unit, you have to make sure that you're delivering the functions that your clients or your customers need or stakeholders. So that's feature function. Are you developing it and delivering it in a quality manner? Are you delivering it in a timely fashion? And depending on how you account for all of the internal information that goes on in your department, are you doing it at the right cost or sometimes price if you're an external unit like the sales department? The other things you have to measure, and they're measurable. By the way, those four attributes, function, timeliness, quality, and price, that's all quantifiable. The other two aspects are relationship and image. How do you want to be seen by your stakeholders and customers? I don't care if you're an internal organization or you have customer-facing requirements. And what kind of relationships do you want to have? Those are more qualitative, but they can still be measured. Then here's where we go right back to the tier 1 organization-wide objectives. Before you start looking at your specific tier 2 business unit or division unit strategy, you got to look and say everything we learned from number 5 all the way back from 1 to 5, what did we learn there? And now based on that input, that's going to eke out some strategic objectives that come out of that process. And you're going to say, hey, but first, before we build ours, which do those information capsules tell us we support from tier 1? Well, let's take a very simple one. If you're a sales department and you're in a for-profit organization, you are definitely going to have an impact on sales revenue and reducing costs. Now, because you're customer facing, and that's what's going to drive revenue, and you're going to have to do it in a very, very cost-effective manner. Do you have an impact on profitability? Not as much as strong as on the revenue and cost, because you have no control at a unit level on other things related to profitability. Now, if you're an HR department, you don't customer face typically. I don't think I've ever been in a circumstance in 47 years of business where the HR's department's been out with me working with a customer. Consequently, the only thing that most independent units, internal units at tier 2 level have are reducing costs and containing costs. So it becomes a process where you have to think about your ability to affect change based on what you have an input to and the things that you have to deliver and how you do that and to who you deliver it to. You create your own strategic objectives for the business support unit. You set your own KPIs up for those objectives, and you create your own initiatives and projects for that department. And this is something that you're going to look at every year, because what happens over the course of 12 months, typically in any organization, is your enablers and challenges, which are your SWOT, your customer value proposition, and your customer stakeholder needs change. It could be just subtle changes or some cases major changes, but it changes on typically an annual basis to some extent, especially the enablers and challenges, which are SWOT. Now, once you get inside the department, you got to bring it down to the tier 3 level. You got those strategic objectives now at the tier 2 level for the department, and you have to develop individual scorecards or goals for your teams and individuals. So these are some of the things that you take a look at. You have to look at their job functions to make sure they're performing what's on document and what you expect them to do. You might set up accomplishment objectives, development objectives, and as well as behavioral objectives. What are you going to measure as a part of a team performance? And then how are you going to individually score that? Either individually, no team, individually with a team. And then you're obviously going to have to go through the performance appraisal side, which is typically made up of a combination of quantitative and qualitative. Here's an example, how to conduct. It's basically just a very simple example of this entire thing I just talked about prior. At the organization-wide level, the organization wants to make sure that every customer is satisfied. I had one client in the Caribbean that the board of directors said, yeah, we like your strategy. We like all your strategic objectives and what you're measuring. But at our level, we're only interested in 4 things. And this is the board, and they're a for-profit, publicly traded company. The board told us, as the designers with the team from the company, they said, we at the profit level, at the financial level, we just want to see if profitability is up. At the customer level, we want the customers fully satisfied. At the process level, we want everything done ultimate efficiency. And at the organizational capacity, we want to make sure that all the employees are satisfied. That's all we ever want to see every quarter when you do the report. You can include the other stuff, but we only want to focus on those 4 things. Well, think about it. Publicly traded, they're looking at the things that are mattering to the organization, which in this case being for profit is profitability. And also they want to make sure the customers are happy, and efficiency lends itself to savings and costs, and usually better prices to the customers, so their revenues would go up. And they want to make sure that the people that generate this, the individuals, the employees, are happy. So consequently, it comes down to something like this. This is customer sat. The performance measure is % of customers satisfied with information received over the internet. This is pretty specific. This is something that was developed by one of the parts on tier 1, which is probably talking about their e-commerce, et cetera, et cetera. They also wanted to create portals, came out of there. They dropped it down to this department. Maybe it was sales department. And the business sales department said, yeah, we can improve our information on available services. And their measure is service availability awareness survey score. And then their project's going to be a communications program announcing the new online information hotline. And then passing it down to the individuals, there's 3 things that need to happen here. Accomplishment. So they want to make sure when they're improving the web and print delivery content, it's done on time, minimal rework. On the behavior side, they need to get skills. And for professional development, personal professional development, they need to get web design training at a local community college. So they got very specific down at the employee level what they wanted to work on. But this is what happens through a typical alignment process going forward. Now, how do you measure the success? Well, these are all good measures, but I like number 4 the best. But the question is, if we got the alignment put in place properly, tier 1, organization-wide, tier 2 down to the department, down to the tier 3, you could say game over, I've knocked out the silos. Because now all the other things that silos were driving, bad communications, no cooperation, no easily sharing of resources, et cetera, should be wiped off the map. And the only reason I say gone with a question mark is the one thing that even alignment doesn't help you with are the politics inside of an organization. But over time, those seem to work out when the strategies of the organization and the departments start working. And oh, by the way, on this alignment process, just think about it. You got to take time to build the tier 1 strategy. You got to take time to build all the tier 2 strategies at the department. Then you got to take time to put in the tier 3 assigning of personal goals, objectives. This is where you'd also assign things like OKRs down there as well. The reason I say don't think that this is a light switch, that when you're done, you just flip the switch and it's working. Most strategies take 2 to 3 years that are fully aligned to be institutionalized. So you have to work on it on a steady basis through what's something we call strategy execution cadence. And so that you're successful all the way through as you move through the process. What are the benefits? Well, the biggest one here is those responsible for strategy development and those responsible for strategy implementation collaborate effectively. If you remember before, that was a disjointed statement from why alignment's needed. Other ones are important, but this collaboration business is the key one that goes on. You've got departments and executive suites and individuals talking to each other all the time, which should be the case when you have strategies built at all 3 levels. This one here is a good one on the interaction and information, because look at this one that says, first of all, I've got interaction and communications across the senior levels. We got the senior executive suite talking, but then this is second and third is perfect. More senior levels to less senior ones are interacting and giving information, and the other way around. We got the lower levels talking back up to the senior levels. So there's a full circle of communications and discussion going on. Because once you're aligned with your strategies, you have to have quarterly meetings on this. You have to have monthly meetings on the projects and initiatives that are going on throughout the organization. So this alignment process drives these 3 bullets into action in a deeper and faster manner. Now, the last 3 are critical. When you go through the alignment process, you're going to find you have a state or a case for reallocation of funding among the various strategic elements. The other thing is the reallocation of personnel, because you got to put personnel on these projects or initiatives or share some of their expertise between departments. And the other thing does, you identify new risks that maybe have to be contended with and mitigated, but also you identify new opportunities that you pick up. One of the things you can find out, this is, by the way, this alignment process is one of the dimensions of the Balanced Scorecard Institute's strategic management maturity model, which by that website link at the bottom left, you can go out and take that and you'll get an assessment based on your questions. It's not heavy duty, but it will tell you where you are between a scale of 1 to 5 based on those maturity level labels. In each of those dimensions. We're only focusing on the alignment one today. But future webinars that I'll be developing for this is going to be all based off the strategic management maturity model. And in fact, in one of the questions that was pre-submitted that we'll cover in a minute, I put a reminder about what's coming up in January. Does this strategic management maturity model work? Well, this was one of my clients that started their work in 2013. Started out with the average score across the board of 2.31 out of 5. And over the years of steady work based on make all those things that go into alignment and cascading and all of the sustainabilities, the culture, everything now in play, they managed to make some significant improvements, especially in the alignment. Went from an average of 2.0 in 2013 to 2017, 4.0. You might say, well, Joe, why don't you have any data for 18, 19, and 20? The company was bought. So that sometimes is a downside of being successful. You become an acquisition target. Now, a few reminders. We got a recording that's coming out with a link. This is a repeat. You can do the assessment model online. And again, use the Q&A box, not the question box for questions. Now, I see we got 11 questions, but we had 4 people for this first session submit pre-questions that they wanted some answers to. for this. So I feel obligated that because they did take the time to fill in the box and say, well, what about this? What about this? We're going to handle those first, and maybe we'll knock down some of those of the 11. And the ones that we don't get done, Candace and I will collaborate, and I will make sure I get questions to you by email, what your question was. And you can see the way I usually respond to questions when I do that coming up. All right. So here's the first submitted question, pre-submitted questions. Someone asked, how is strategy aligned with the resources? Well, when you get done building a strategy, especially at the corporate level, organization-wide, enterprise-wide, tier 1, you probably already have what we call OPEX, which is your annual operating expense. And you've also probably got something called StratEx or CapEx for your capital projects, which are handled differently in the accounting world because usually the immensity of the expenditures. When you get done with building a tier 1, and by the way, you would also do this at tier 2, you have to create what's called a StratEx or a strategy expenditure budget, strategy dollars. And here's the reason why. At the tier 1 level, organization-wide, remember I characterized those initiatives and projects as organization-wide. They're usually high dollar amount. Any of you that have gone through a data warehouse, an ERP system, or any kind of database changeover, many of you are also going to digitalization projects now. Those all have to go into the strategic StratEx budget because they need to be protected from year to year because they have strategic objectives associated with those. The quickest way to kill your strategy is to be funding projects and initiatives over a 5-year period for a particular project, get into it to 2 or 3 years, and then all of a sudden cut funding. You have just gutted your strategy by that simple action. So you have to be very structured, very vigilant, and very ferocious in making sure that those StratEx dollars are being used strictly for the strategic objectives of success going forward. Another question came in is, how do you link or align the HR strategy to the broader corporate strategy using the Balanced Scorecard? Well, I went out in this case because this question came from an educational institution, and I used some work we did with Upstate Medical University. And here's a tier 1 strategy map. And the interesting thing in here is take a look at what's happening down, what's happening down here in this organizational capabilities level. Now, this was because they talked about the HR strategy in their question. My definition of the organizational perspective, sometimes called organizational capacity or people, tools, and technology, the whole strategy doesn't get started without that perspective. And I think I mentioned this before, but my definition of organizational capabilities and capacities is you have the right people with the right skills at the right time. You provide them the right tools, the right technology, and the right infrastructure, and you provide the right governance. Let's face it, that simple definition, you can't do anything in an organization without almost all of those being running at full capacity and full capabilities. So consequently, you are intimately and explicitly linked to the strategy because it all starts with this HR component going forward. And then, as I said earlier, you use all of that to improve the internal processes. In this case, it was improve efficiency, accountability, et cetera. I'm not going to read those. And then that has, in the case of an institution, like a college or university or any school or a government, your whole purpose in life is to create in this case, the learners, patients, community, and other stakeholders. That's the quality of life at the other end. And then in between, you have to be good financial stewards. You have to make sure you're using your budget and mobilizing it and putting it in play, and that you expend it within reason, and you take fiduciary manner in which you execute on that, and of course, full transparency. So that linkage for HR is fundamentally and explicitly involved with the strategy because it has total ownership, for the most part, to an entire perspective, holding all the objectives that have been created along that perspective. Someone asked, I would like to see the integration with risk management. Now, this is interesting because risk is one of those things you can decide what you want to identify and then put a risk matrix together and a mitigation capabilities against it. And other times, risk is going to be identified by this next webinar that I'm producing for January. It comes out of the results of doing some of these planning scenarios, foresight, strategic foresight analysis, and inflection point analysis. But in its essence, when you're looking for attaching how the integration with risk happens in the alignment, it all goes to the two levels again. I mean, we know there are risks associated at the employee level, but those are usually so far downstream that it's usually things that happen above that, which in this case is the tier 1, and then also things at the tier 2. So for instance, in the for-profit world, of course, you have risk related to our strategy, for instance, growth. If they've got a growth strategy, market expansion, anything that they're tackling that's new, they could assess a risk involved with that, especially at the financial level. Do we make any investments or not? Do we look into the research or not? And then at the risk level on the tier 1 with objectives, which is improve the customer experience, what is it that we're going to put in place, and what type of experience does the customer have to have improved, and what's the risk involved in rolling that out? On the other side, it's related to the projects like web redesign. What can go wrong with web redesign? I guess all over the news today is this whole business about how the federal government of the U.S. was fundamentally hacked at multiple organizations, which you would think were relatively unhackable, but apparently they're not. So what are the risks associated with that? And then down at the tier 2 level, they want to put in an automated billing system. So what are the risks involved with that? Well, typically, if you've had some of the same experiences I've had, you can put this stuff all together, but you miss one or two things that turns out that the users can't use it very easily. So you got a risk involved in that because you didn't have the training spec'd out and in the depth of analysis that they needed. Finally, some of the, again, that statement, key risk indicators, they can define anywhere you need them to assess those factors that may affect performance. The webinar in January is going to focus around just a very brief look at scenario planning, foresight analysis, and inflection point analysis, and then some of the things that we have done or are planning to do in terms of offerings from the consulting side or potentially training side later on. Here was an interesting one. The question was, can you talk about cascading the mission, vision, and values down through the organization? Well, you know now that you don't cascade the vision and the values. They stay at the purview of the organization wide, but you do cascade and create at each department level or unit level their own purpose or mission statement. And this particular one, he was thinking about governments where they're taking advantage of individual branches, developing their own mission and vision that is strategically aligned. I'm very much in favor of the development of their own mission or purpose statement. Don't let departments start creating vision statements, because pretty soon you'll have a competition and send a message to anybody that reads this on either your website or in the posters, the wall posters in your offices, whatever. So which vision are we following? And I don't care if you're in a department. The vision of the organization is what sets the tone going forward. In this case, this was a good one. Justice Department develop a broad mission and vision. They should have stopped at mission. But the courts, sheriffs, and corrections branches deliver their own mission. That's okay, because that's what they need to do to deliver whatever services or products to whom and for what benefit. And is it in good practice for those to develop their own statements? Yes, on mission. And then they have to develop their own strategic objectives and do the same analysis that was repeated from the slide before. In summary, though, the departments follow the higher organization's vision, values, strategic themes, which in some organizations are called strategic drivers, strategic priorities, strategic goals, and they also have the same perspective labels organizational capacity, internal process, customer stakeholder, or financial. I'll also include this one, which is coming up in the section next, because how do I use the balanced scorecard in my company to increase profitability? This is a scorecard for a for-profit organization. How do I know it's for-profit? The perspective financials at the top. And then it's underneath that is customer. If it were nonprofit or government, those two would be flipped around. Because remember, governments and nonprofits are changing quality of life, or citizens, or some stakeholder group that they're looking at. But to answer that question, it really is an interaction of these strategic objectives that very specifically say, in this case of profitability, I have to reduce costs in order to have an impact on profits, and I have to have revenue increases in target markets, in this case, to have an increase in profits. And oh, by the way, I also have to make sure I'm delivering a customer experience that our customers want, need, and pay for going forward. So it's the interaction on the answer to this question is 3 different objectives. And the interesting thing about for-profits is when we're working with organizations that are for-profit, we don't waste any amount of time talking about the objectives on that financial perspective, because they're always the same in some way, shape, or form. All right, Candace, do we want to try to look at some of the Q&As that came in today? Can I do that? Let's see what we got here. All right, we'll take it. I take the top ones are the most current. So let's take a look at those. I'm an early bird user of BSC, and I was trained by Professor Norton Kaplan. They are the godfathers of the Balanced Scorecard. How can the BSC help our digital transformation projects? I think you have Spider Impact software, but how strong is the support to the DX projects? Thanks a lot. I know more to know more about us, etc. Now, a good question, Nader. The interesting thing is when I look at digitalization, and I've had several clients that have started digitalization projects, and they wind up being strategic objectives right on the strategy map, very explicit, because that does 2 things. First of all, it keeps it in focus in the organization, and it also lets the employee base know that this is an important thing to the organization. Then inside of that, if that's handled by a specific department, that objective at the corporate-wide strategy gets cascaded or aligned down to the department that's taking care of it. Some departments it's MIS, other departments it's marketing. All depends on what the organization, where they want to set it. And you measure it just like any other objective. You set up KPIs against it, and you create projects that, by the way, for everyone on this call, and you might not like this next statement, but from my perspective, when you look at strategic initiatives or projects, there's only one thing we care about in the strategy world at the strategic level, tier 1, tier 2. We want those projects that are identified against those objectives to be completed on time and on budget. Do we ignore all the other internal project measures like, variance in time to completion, variance in time to budget? No, because that helps the project manager and the project teams to stay on track. As an overall assessment, we only want on time and on budget. So I always like to follow it up with, so if you know your organization, and I'll use the very hard words, does a terrible job of completing projects on time and on budget, you have a problem that you need to fix, because that's going to show up as a dent in the success of your strategic objectives. Because if you haven't figured it out, and you can look at this graphic that's in the back, objectives had 2 streams of influence against it. KPIs associated with that objective, and the results of the projects or the initiatives. Are they on time and on budget? Meaty, what is business and support units? Business and support units are just like departments, but they may be called something different. Some organizations, they're made up of, depending on what business they're in, all they are support units. That they call them support units because they like to think that they send the message that they support the customer, and that's okay. But again, they are just a department or a support unit. Now, Meaty, the one definition that does change some of this is if you've got a holding company that has organization-wide strategy for the holding company, and then it has any number of lines of business that it's responsible to be successful at. They may have a series of business and support units that are the traditional units in a singular organization, like HR, IT, financial, legal, marketing, because those are shared services typically across all the lines of business. So that's another definition, a little deeper definition on business and support units. Elizabeth, I'm interested in learning how to align other strategies with the organization, such as data management, to the corporate strategy. Very good question. And oftentimes, those strategies obviously exist inside maybe of a department or a business or support unit. And because those strategies should have been cascaded off of a higher level, corporate level one, which in maybe cases of this one on data management, maybe you have something like this one showing here, you have an optimize of technology, or you have something in the internal processing that relates to improved data management. And this is across the organization, and it gets cascaded or aligned down to the lower level departments or support units. All right, I think that takes us to the end. Now, the rest of these, I will make sure that I get a response to you. Candace has captured who submitted them, and we've got your registration. So key thing, guys, and I'm going to shut this down, just go back up here for a second. I hope that this your time on this webinar was beneficial. Don't be bashful about sending me questions for follow-up information. And I like to, my mission on this was not only to engage you with understanding what alignment, strategy alignment is all the way through the organization and the nuances of how you can get that done, the things you have to look for. But sometimes you'll get some questions that come up later after you look at the documentation, and just shoot me a question. I'll be happy to give you an email, or if it's a lengthy response, I'll just probably say, let's pick a time and date to have a phone call going forward. I want everyone to have a good rest of their day.